Something about this story refuses to stay buried, because just when the timeline looked airtight, just when the date seemed locked, just when the narrative felt too clean to question, suddenly a shock twist slips through. And now the question is no longer what is Meghan's real age, it's who decided what the world was allowed to believe in the first place.
She wasn't going to give her time or her energy to the British people or serving humanity.
Meghan Markle never thought in a million years that she would provide proof of her real age.
Keep the same energy for the rest of the information that is on here, including the date of her birth, which shows August 4th, 1981.
The date is sitting there, bold, repeated, almost too perfect, August 4th, 1981, and on the surface, it behaves like an unquestionable truth, a fixed point in a life that has been documented, photographed, archived, and retold across years of interviews, profiles, and carefully shaped public appearances. It lines up neatly with everything: the education, the early acting years, the rise into global visibility, the shift into royal life, the exit, the reinvention, the entire arc that people have watched unfold piece by piece. And yet, the more perfectly it fits, the more some people start to lean in closer, as if perfection itself is the clue. Because here is the uncomfortable tension that refuses to go away. The story works, but the belief doesn't always follow. And that is exactly where Lady C steps in again. Not with a loud explosion this time, but with something far more dangerous. A suggestion that feels small, almost casual, but once it lands, it refuses to leave. She doesn't need to rewrite the timeline. She doesn't need to produce a shocking document. She doesn't even need to prove anything outright. All she needs to do is shift the angle, just slightly, just enough to make people look at the same date and wonder if they've been looking at it the wrong way all along.
So, Meghan Markle is off by a few years there. 1997, she would have been 16 or 17 years old.
Because what if the story isn't about the date being wrong? What if it's about the way the date has been protected, repeated, reinforced so consistently that questioning it feels almost forbidden? And once that thought enters the conversation, it changes everything. It stops being about numbers and starts becoming about control, about narrative, about who gets to define reality when millions are watching. And suddenly, that simple birthday starts to feel like a locked door. But every locked door invites curiosity. And curiosity is where this story begins to unravel again.
So, if you go over on Google, is she lying about her age? It currently says August 4th, 1981, that she is 41. Well, she would be 42 today.
Because Lady C isn't just poking at a rumor, she's pressing on something deeper, something that has been quietly building for years, a tension between image and authenticity, between what is shown and what is believed, between the polished version and the messy reality people suspect might exist underneath. And once that tension is activated, it spreads fast, because it connects to something much bigger than one date on a page. It connects to trust, and trust, once shaken, doesn't quietly repair itself. It fractures, it echoes, it repeats. So now the story starts to shift again, not forward, but sideways into places people weren't looking before. Old listings get pulled up again. Forgotten profiles reappear. Screenshots that once felt irrelevant suddenly feel like clues. Not proof, not confirmation, but fragments. And fragments are enough when the audience is already leaning toward doubt. And here's where the twist tightens. Because the rumor doesn't survive because it's strong, it survives because it fits into something people already feel. A pattern, a suspicion, a sense that the public version of Meghan has always been just slightly too controlled, slightly too curated, slightly too ready. So when Lady C reopens the age mystery, she isn't reviving a dead rumor, she's feeding a living one. And that's when the conversation becomes dangerous. Because once people stop asking, is this true, and start asking, why does this feel hidden, the rules change completely. Now it's not about evidence anymore, it's about instinct. It's about that quiet voice in the audience that says something doesn't fully settle, something doesn't fully click, something feels like it's been arranged just a little too perfectly. And that voice doesn't need documents, it doesn't need confirmation, it just needs repetition. And repetition is exactly what this story has had for years. But then comes the part no one expected, the part that doesn't break the timeline, doesn't expose a secret, doesn't reveal a hidden document, but instead complicates everything in a way that makes the entire debate harder to simplify. Because suddenly, this isn't just Meghan's timeline anymore. anymore. It's shared. It overlaps. It mirrors. And now people are looking at it from a completely different angle. One that wasn't part of the original rumor at all. One that doesn't scream scandal but whispers something far more unsettling. What if the story isn't wrong but designed to feel unquestionable? And that's where the real shift happens. Because once the conversation moves from what is her age to why does the story feel so controlled, there's no clean way back. And just when the story feels like it's circling the same question again and again, it suddenly shifts into something far more uncomfortable. Because now the focus is no longer trapped on a single date, it begins to move outward, toward the people around Meghan, toward the connections that seem ordinary on the surface, but start to look unusually significant the moment they are pulled into this narrative. And that is exactly where Abigail Spencer enters the frame. Not as an outsider, not as a critic, not as someone trying to tear the story apart, but as someone who has always existed quietly within it. Someone whose presence was never meant to become part of a controversy, yet suddenly becomes impossible to ignore the moment her detail aligns too perfectly with the very thing being questioned. Because Abigail Spencer is not just another name floating around Meghan's world, she is tied to the same date, the same timeline, the same neatly placed marker that has been repeated again and again. And that alignment does something unexpected. It doesn't confirm the rumor, it doesn't destroy the rumor, it traps it in a space where it becomes harder to explain either way. Because now the narrative has to account for something it wasn't designed to face. A shared detail that reinforces the official story while simultaneously feeding the curiosity of those already looking for cracks. And that is where the tension becomes almost impossible to resolve, because every explanation now feels incomplete. And this is where the conversation becomes more layered than it ever intended to be. Because Abigail Spencer doesn't act like a piece of evidence, she acts like a mirror, reflecting the same timeline back into the discussion, but from a completely different angle, forcing people to question not just whether Meghan's age is accurate, but why something so simple has turned into something so heavily examined. And once that reflection is seen, it becomes difficult to look away from it, because it adds a new dimension to the debate, one that wasn't part of the original rumor but now feels deeply connected to it. And suddenly the focus shifts again, not toward proving or disproving a number, but toward understanding why the presence of Abigail Spencer makes the entire situation feel more complicated rather than more certain. Because if the timeline holds steady, if the dates align, if everything continues to point in the same direction, then why does the conversation refuse to settle? Why does the doubt continue to expand instead of collapse? And why does every attempt to close the question seem to open another one instead? Because now the story is no longer about a hidden fact waiting to be discovered. It becomes about a perception that refuses to stabilize, a sense that something about the narrative feels constructed in a way that invites scrutiny. And once that feeling takes hold, it doesn't disappear easily. It grows, it spreads, it attaches itself to every detail that can be re-examined, every moment that can be revisited, every connection that can be questioned. And that is exactly what has happened here, because the conversation has moved far beyond the original claim and into something much broader. And that broader space is where Lady C continues to operate, not by delivering a single decisive blow, but by maintaining the pressure, by keeping the question alive, by allowing the audience to sit inside the uncertainty rather than escape it. Because the power of this story doesn't come from proving anything, it comes from making people feel like there is always one more layer they haven't seen, yet one more angle that hasn't been fully explored, one more possibility that hasn't been ruled out. And as Meghan approaches that milestone moment, that 45th birthday that should have been nothing more than a simple celebration, the weight of this narrative presses harder, because now the date itself becomes symbolic, not just of age, but of everything that has been said, questioned, defended, and debated over the years, turning what should be a straightforward fact into something that carries the entire tension of her public identity. Because at this point, the story has outgrown its original shape. It is no longer about whether Meghan's age is correct or incorrect. It is about why so many people feel compelled to question it at all, why the conversation keeps returning to the same point even when the timeline appears stable, and why the presence of Abigail Spencer, instead of closing the loop, has only made the loop feel tighter, more intricate, more difficult to untangle. And that is where the real uncertainty settles in, not as a clear accusation, not as a proven claim, but as an unresolved tension that lingers beneath everything. Because if the official story holds, and if the details continue to align, then the only thing left to question is not the date itself, but the reaction to it, the persistence of the doubt, the refusal of the narrative to fully settle into something everyone accepts without hesitation.